Thanks as always for listening to Fluff and Crunch. In today's episode, Chris grills me about the changes to both the system and the setting that I am making to my 2D20 WorldBuilders fantasy role-playing game, Ahris. In this episode, we discuss some of the specific mechanical changes that I have decided on after having been working on this game for a year now, and an expansion of the setting material that will be in this backwards compatible core book. All right, I'm recording. Good morning, Chris. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. On this recording on Martin Luther King Day, so I'm off from both my jobs, and you're not. So
I'm off now because I have worked already.
Right,
today,
you're off for the evening.
Yes.
Cool. So how are things of late? Have you gotten any gaming in recently? Anything like that?
Guys were over on at the weekend, but we played Friday. That's part of the weekend. And I assumed that Scott was going to bring board games. I thought he'd got board games for Christmas, but that was kind of the plan. And then he turned up, I was like, well, no, I didn't really get anything. I was like, oh. I bought the G.I. Joe deck building game over Christmas. We played that, and then I think they were planning to play the Assassin's Creed Quick Start next, but that was about it. How about you?
It is playoff season. And so I was forced to preempt our game on Saturday night because we had to watch the Chiefs beat up on the Dolphins, who phoned it in the second half of the game. Went to sleep, phoned it in, clearly demonstrated that they were not a serious football team, and they actually really didn't want to win that game. So none whatsoever. And I've got to figure out what I'm going to do this coming Saturday night, because there is another big game on Saturday night. And I just don't, the rest of one of my players really, it likes football. The other three could not care less. So I've got to figure that one out.
This is one of the things where people are watching, because I'll watch games with my team if I am free, like Mika's not around, but I won't watch any other team, ever.
Oh.
Ever. I mean, other people do. There are people that will just, my dad will just, watch any kind of sport that's on. But pretty much, I have limited time. There is no way I am watching someone else's team play someone else's team, because, I don't care. I always want to draw.
No, you know what? We've watched a lot of we are less. I am less a single team fan than an NFL football fan. And so watching games and watching how teams have progressed throughout the season, and then watching how two different teams that may have played each other in the regular season, may not have, play one another in the playoffs, and seeing how they interact and what happens. Watching the Packers absolutely stomp the Cowboys yesterday was a trip. It's just interesting. So we are different in that respect.
I'll check the results in that respect. Well, also, I mean, your football has a season which lasts sort of 4 months plus, then the playoffs and that's 5. That's not a season. That's half a season.
But it's very intense. So,
it's not very. They play one. Sorry, very intense. How many games do they? 17.
17.
That's pathetic.
But they run into each other a lot.
No, that is terrible. Okay, that is the least amount of games played by any professional sports team. Even
my wife is
women,
laughing at you in the background.
Even our women that we joke is I always say it's not a full enough season. They still play 22 games, and that's not including the 2 cup commanders. They'll still do 40 games a season plus internationals. But our male foot players are pulling 70, 80 games a season, because you're playing 38 games in the Premier League, plus Champions League, plus League Cup, FA Cup. And then if you're an international, you're playing more. I mean, 17 games and you call yourself professional athletes.
I do.
Shocking.
My wife is still laughing at you in the background. So anywho, yeah. So that's what I did. No gaming. But I have been working a lot on my remastered edition of Ahris, and that's what we're here to talk about. Now, what was nice, it's not a second edition. It is not a revised edition. A friend of mine suggested I should call it a remastered version, because then it kind of sounds a little bit metal. So that's what I'm going with.
It sounds like a video game developer that you've released your game and a year later you're releasing it with slight improvements and calling it a remake, a different game. Well, Street Fighter Super.
I think that you will find in our discussion today, thank you for your Snoop Dogg picture. As I said, I'm pimping Ahris. I'm pimping my game. And so you have, you should have had Superfly up there, but whatever.
It's the Huggy Bear was the first one that came into my head.
First one
it was
that came
easier
up.
to find a slightly more modern one than the old one.
You need to go back to the classics like Superfly from the 70s or Dolomite. Anyway, we're going to talk about what I'm doing with Ahris right now and how I am remastering the setting and the system to an extent, and when I'm going to release that. So how do we want to go through this? Would you like to start peppering me with questions, or do you want me to give you an overview? I want to help people understand what I am doing with the game, so that if they have it already, they'll know what's coming. And if they don't, they will get energized and excited about getting it when I'm done.
Oh, before we get into what, let's go with why. Why are you...
Okay.
Why?
Okay. Well, I started writing Ahris last January, a year ago, when the SRD and the publishing rules and whatnot were let loose by Modifius. And I finished it in May and I released it in June. So about 7 months ago. And in that time, I have run it at conventions. I have run it at home. I've done one-offs. I've done one-offs and short, session or three with characters I've created, with characters my players have. I've beat on it a bunch. I've kicked the tires and I've taken it out for a spin. And there were some at the lowest level. There are some things mechanically that I discovered that I didn't like. They were not producing at the table the kinds of outcomes that I hoped that they would to create the kind of feel and the kind of gameplay experience that I hope for. So I've said, one, there are some rules, things that I need to change. The second thing is that, and I had said this in the original introduction, that my interest was in getting down a workable fantasy system first, and then sussing or really building out the world. Because I recognized that if I just focused on world building, I would be working on it and it would never get done. The game would never get done because I would always be puttering with world things. What has happened now is that I have developed more world, and I've realized that, one, I want to include more world in the core rulebook, but then also there are things about, and you and I have talked about this plenty of times, how a system ought to work to evoke or facilitate the intended or stated vibe or feel or goals of a setting. As I have developed the setting, the backdrop more, I realized that there were some rules, additions, changes, some things that I needed to do to make the game do that. So a couple of things that I would have changed regardless, and then some rules expressions that go along with more setting information and the more setting information itself. So those three things are what motivated me to do this. And also, I built the thing on a word processor, which gave me far more gray hairs than I had wanted to get from that experience, because formatting and dealing with images in a word was a nightmare. I have since learned at least the rudiments of using a system or a program called Affinity Publisher.
Yeah, that's what I've got.
And so I'm using that to make it look a lot nicer and flow better and all that. So formatting, it was also a motivation to do this.
Because you said you're not just redoing the one book, you said you're going to split it. So what's it going to look like then?
Well, no. Okay. I what I'm doing is I'm redoing the core rule book. And by redoing, I mean there are some mechanical rules tweaks that I'm implementing. There are some things that I'm changing that are entirely backwards compatible with the original version. So if someone's out there playing the original version, they're like, I don't want to change this piece within combat, then they don't have to. It's still going to work. Their version of it will work a little differently and will do the things that I would rather it not do because of a greater sense of how the setting should feel. But whatever, it's your table, do as you will. So I'm taking the core rule book, making those rules changes, and also adding a bunch of setting information. So whereas the setting chapter in the book last time was only about 12 pages, and there were some comments here and there throughout the book, that 12 pages is now, instead of near the end of the book, is at the beginning of the book. Like, everybody who's in this knows this. Everyone who's in this world knows these things. And then in the GM chapter, I'm going to add a bunch more. So what this is going to do is it's going to result in some rules changes, some additional canon, and that the book itself is going to be longer. So the book was about 200 pages before all of the I added all the reference material, which was just a collection of tables that were spread throughout the book and lists of, effects and qualities and all that kind of stuff. So when it comes to like pure content, there was a roughly 200 pages. And my guess is there's probably going to be 10, 20, maybe even 30 more pages. It's going to grow in size and look a lot nicer.
Okay, so what's the difference? So we've got more stuff in it then. What else are you doing? So you're adding more setting stuff. What else are we doing rules wise?
Okay. Well, a couple of things. The minimum is there were, like I said, I discovered some things, especially in combat, that I was not happy about. I had used, like, I had taken from Octon Cthulhu and the SRD the depending on a character's in my game stamina. They had like a baseline toughness, which was like native damage reduction. So if you were unarmored and you had a really high stamina, maybe you would have toughness of 2. So that would just knock 2 points of damage right off the top. And then I used the range of armor from 1 to 5 that's in the SRD, or at least was the base that was presented there. And I had not sat back and thought, like, wait a minute, what's going to happen when those two things come together? So I had run I ran a one-off with more experienced characters. I took the experience system. I gave the players a heap of experience points. They built up their characters. They were like the heroes of the realm. Okay. So one of them had a high armor, had big plate armor, and it was magic and all this stuff. And he was also exceptionally tough. And what it meant was, in Ahris, one of the things this is still in, is that a successful hit always, no matter what, does 1 point of damage. 1 point of stress, rather. What was happening is this character's armor and native damage reduction were so high that no matter how much damage was getting, practically 1 point of damage. And so it was creating this like horrid 4th edition grind. Right. Wait a minute. So this is something that more experienced characters with better equipment and higher stats, these two things are going to come together and they're going to create a grind in combat. And I was like, all right, that's not good. So what I did is I actually dumped toughness entirely. So you already have more stress because your stamina is higher. You don't need that further reflected in an additional damage reduction. And then I also changed the levels of armor. So armor maxes out lower. Right. And armor is a little less granular in terms of this is the armor rating and this is the specific kind. What I did is I differentiated armor into soft, flexible, and hard. So like leather type stuff, mesh chain type stuff, and plate. And each of those had their armor rating 1, 2, and 3. And so what it does is it keeps the combat a little deadlier so that people approach it a little more intelligently. And we found that mechanically it then pushes away from likelihood of a grind. So that was one of the major things. There are also some tweaks that I'm making to the magic system to make it easier for people to understand it, the spell building system, and build their own spells. There are some explanatory changes that I'm making, and I'm also going to further clarify like how do healing spells work and how do buff spells work, because I've run into some places where the rules just they're less clear than I would like them to be. I want them to be more descriptive than prescriptive, so that people can adjust to the way they want their table to be. But I think there's also a point, and I know I've gotten annoyed at this. You buy a game and you're reading it and you're like, where are the rules? Like, what did I just pay you for? And I don't want that. And so there's a balance that I think in some of the areas, especially with magic, I need to clarify and provide more structure and specificity so that people can more easily connect to it. And then if they want to change things or, break the system on their own, they can. But I think it's easier to go from a little more specificity to less rather than the other way around. So there are some changes in that as well.
What's going to happen in terms of on DriveThru? Is it still just going to is it going to replace the existing book then?
Good question. What I'm going to do when this one is finished is I'm going to upload it as an additional. So you know how in DriveThru, when you upload things, you can delete the previous copies if you want to. I'm just going to leave the other copy up there. Also, what I'm going to do is, I mean, that's my plan at this point. However, there are a lot of things, like for example, here's a pretty prominent change, I think, actually. I'm changing some of the character archetypes, and I'm going to take 4 of them and move them entirely into the GM chapter as entirely optional.
Right.
And so, depending on how I go about moving and making certain rules that are in the current edition totally optional, if I end up doing that in full, and preserve everything but move things to that optional section, I may just replace it. But my inclination is to leave the one that's there, the most current version, leave it, and then upload this one as the preferred and supported version, even though, like I said, mechanically it's all backwards compatible.
What are you thinking of doing next then?
What do you mean?
Well, so you've done this new remastered version, but then what Ahris stuff are you planning on writing?
Okay. Actually, as part of this remastered edition, like I said, there's a lot more world content. And so as part of that, describing what do I mean by a rare magic world, not a low magic world, a rare magic world. What is that? I go into a lot more detail about what that means in like meta terms, but also what does that look like in the world itself. And to that end, in the existing edition, there are 4 archetypes that are magic using. There's a cleric, a druid, a sorcerer, and a wizard. And those are about as you would say, like bog standard, analogs for D&D classes as you could get in name too. Ahris is a rare magic setting. That is magic that is of low power, of high power, is known and accepted. It is just not common because it is only held in the hands of the elves. Only the elves use magic. Only the elves have the ability to use magic. Dwarves, and to a far lesser extent gnomes, have some limited, call it like item-based magic, like petty enchantments. But when it comes to spell magic, that's the elves only. So they have this like monopoly on it. But what's happening is, as part of the world, as part of the core story, is that magic is creeping back. It's bubbling back or bubbling into the world, and it is showing up among the younger races. That is dwarves, humans, gnomes, and half elves. So non-elves are starting in little pockets, little unique instances, are starting to use what looks like spell magic. And so if you think about it, a world like that, there would be no such thing, because elves are not a playable race. There's no such thing as a full-time caster in a world where there are no full-time casters that are playable. You know what I mean?
Right. Okay.
And so what I'm doing is I'm moving those 4 archetypes into the GM's chapter as like, look, if you would just want to run like these and erase this kind of rare magic, then go for it. I'll leave those there. But what I'm doing instead with magic usage is you choose your archetype, and then if you want to use magic, or you want to open the doorway to be able to in some way, shape, or form, you're going to use talents to purchase the ability to do that. And then over time, you have an economy of points that are connected to character development. So look, for example, if you make a warrior, okay, that's one of the archetypes, and you decide to make like an archer. Okay, so you're a cool archer, and you decide either at character generation or along the lines at some point to use experience, you buy through talents access to a form of magic. And then you would then create the spells and create, how does that come out of you? Like, are you a crack shot, or is it something totally unrelated to you being an archer? As magic creeps into the world, it does so unevenly, unexpectedly, and in ways that can be chaotic and destabilizing. And so, like I said, there's no place within that story for a vocation of a caster. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you pick another archetype, and then either, again, at character generation or over time, you decide to incorporate the access to some kind of magic, and then you build spells or abilities, expressions of magic for your character over time. And because, experience obviously is a point-based economy, you would have to then make a decision, like how much am I going to keep up with my cool archer warrior stuff, or as I realize that I can like light my fingertips on fire or something like that, or make my head glow or whatever you decide your magic is going to be. Do you decide to focus more on that, and the other things not lie fallow, but don't develop as much because you decide to make a right turn and focus more on those things. So that's something that you would add to the character, not be the single defining archetype of the character. And I think that's a pretty dramatic story departure that has mechanical implications, but actually doesn't really change the mechanics of how the game works. It just changes what's available and when you would do things and how you would use the existing mechanics to access those things.
I mean, I haven't got anything else to ask about it. So anything else you feel that you need to say or get across?
Well, I think I did the right thing. I built the system that worked and didn't try to engage in comprehensive A to Z world building. When you open up the basic expert materials from D&D from 40 some years ago, or you even open up something like Star Frontiers, Gamma World, lots of games in the olden days, they were a game that had some story ideas based around the mechanics, but they really didn't offer a comprehensive world or even anything close to it. They kind of indicated the kinds of locations and kinds of experiences, but the idea of this comprehensive backdrop was just not there. So I was glad that I did that. But because, again, I'm committed to the idea that your mechanics should express your intended setting and story, like the salient points of those, that it was time, now that I have more of the story clarified, more of the backdrop clarified, it made sense to go back and tweak the mechanics where necessary. The combat thing was a big deal, and make some of those mechanical changes to better express or better, support the world that I'm building. Now, when it comes to other things down the road, I still have an idea of an Ahris world guide, but the question of when or how big, that question will be answered by how much more I add to the core book about the world, and how happy I am with how that stuff turns out in terms of the quantity of it. You know how it is. Creativity and ideas begat more creativity and more ideas. So I may end up writing like 20 or 30 pages of more world content. And then because of that, I'm like, okay, now I can detail out all these other things. We'll say this, though, there will be a lot more information about not just the races, but like where they fit in society and where they live and how they interact with one another. There's going to be a lot more of that. That's going to be Ahris specific. There will be information about religions and deities and faiths and stuff like that isn't there. There will be information in the GM chapter about what's going on outside of the colony. What's going on in the areas that are not formally or officially settled. There will be information like that. So it will still be a game where if people just want to take, again, as I've said, you want to take an old module and you just want to run, fantasy using a 2D20 and not have to come up with your own system, this will do it for you. I think with these minor rules tweaks, it'll do it more effectively. So if you want to do that, that's fine. But I also know that you will be far better equipped to run something along the lines of my vision for Ahris from this than you would have been, a year ago, for sure, or 7 months ago, for sure. And my expectation is to have this thing out by May. Probably will do it earlier because I'm making really good progress. Like I'm in the character generation or character creation chapter right now, and that's where there's a lot of heavy lifting to do. And the book is already about 10% longer than it was. So yeah, I'm making good progress, and my anticipation is to have it out by May, if not sooner. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.